The Princess by Anton Chekhov. A carriage with 4 fine, sleek horses drove in at the big so-called red gate of the monastery. While it was still at a distance, the priests and monks, who were standing in a group round the part of the hostel allotted to the gentry, recognized by the coachman and horses that the lady in the carriage was Princess Vera Gavrilovna, whom they knew very well. An old man in livery jumped off the box and helped the princess to get out of the carriage. She raised her dark veil and moved in a leisurely way up to the priests to receive their blessing. Then she nodded pleasantly to the rest of the monks and went into the hostel. "Well, have you missed your princess?" she said to the monk who brought in her things. "It's a whole month since I've been to see you, but here I am, behold your princess. And where is the Father Superior? My goodness, I am burning with impatience. Wonderful, wonderful old man, you must be proud of having such a superior." When the Father Superior came in, the princess uttered a shriek of delight, crossed her arms over her bosom, and went up to receive his blessing. "No, no, let me kiss your hand," she said, snatching it and eagerly kissing it 3 times. "How glad I am to see you at last, Holy Father. I'm sure you've forgotten your princess, but my thoughts have been in your dear monastery every moment. How delightful it is here. This living for God far from the busy, giddy world has such a special charm of its own, Holy Father, which I feel with my whole soul, although I cannot express it." The princess's cheeks glowed and tears came into her eyes. She talked incessantly, fervently, while the Father Superior, a grave, plain, shy old man of 70, remained mute or uttered abruptly, like a soldier on duty, phrases such as, "Certainly, Your Excellency." "Quite so, I understand." "Has Your Excellency come for a long stay?" he inquired. "I shall stay the night here, and tomorrow I'm going on to Klavdia Nikolaevna's. It's a long time since I've seen her, and the day after tomorrow I'll come back to you and stay 3 or 4 days. I want to rest my soul here among you, Holy Father." The princess liked being at the monastery. For the last 2 years it had been a favourite resort of hers. She used to go there almost every month in the summer and stay 2 or 3 days, even sometimes a week. The shy novices, the stillness, the low ceilings, the smell of cypress, the modest fare, the cheap curtains on the windows, all this touched her, softened her, and disposed her to contemplation and good thoughts. It was enough for her to be half an hour in the hostel for her to feel that she too was timid and modest, and that she too smelt of cypress wood. The past retreated into the background, lost its significance, and the princess began to imagine that in spite of her 29 years she was very much like the old Father Superior, and that like him she was created not for wealth, not for earthly grandeur and love, but for a peaceful life secluded from the world, a life in twilight like the hostel. It happens that a ray of light gleams in the dark cell of the anchorite absorbed in prayer, or a bird alights on the window and sings its song. The stern anchorite will smile in spite of himself, and a gentle, sinless joy will pierce through the load of grief over his sins, like water flowing from under a stone. The princess fancied that she brought from the outside world just such comfort as the ray of light or the bird. Her gay, friendly smile, her gentle eyes, her voice, her jests, her whole personality in fact, her little graceful figure always dressed in simple black, must arouse in simple, austere people a feeling of tenderness and joy. Everyone looking at her must think, "God has sent us an angel," and feeling that no one could help thinking this, she smiled still more cordially and tried to look like a bird. After drinking tea and resting, she went for a walk. The sun was already setting. From the monastery garden came a moist fragrance of freshly watered mignonette, and from the church floated the soft singing of men's voices, which seemed very pleasant and mournful in the distance. It was the evening service. In the dark windows where the little lamps glowed gently, in the shadows, in the figure of the old monk sitting at the church door with a collecting box, there was such unruffled peace that the princess felt moved to tears. Outside the gate, in the walk between the wall and the birch trees where there were benches, it was quite evening. The air grew rapidly darker and darker. The princess went along the walk, sat on a seat, and sank into thought. She thought how good it would be to settle down for her whole life in this monastery, where life was as still and unruffled as a summer evening. How good it would be to forget the ungrateful, dissipated prince, to forget her immense estates, the creditors who worried her every day, her misfortunes, her maid Dasher, who'd looked at her impertinently that morning. It would be nice to sit here on the bench all her life and watch through the trunks of the birch trees the evening mist gathering in wreaths in the valley below, the rooks flying home in a black cloud like a veil far, far away above the forest. Two novices, one astride a piebald horse, another on foot driving out the horses for the night and rejoicing in their freedom, playing pranks like little children. Their youthful voices rang out musically in the still air, and she could distinguish every word. It is nice to sit and listen to the silence. At one moment the wind blows and stirs the tops of the birch trees, then a frog rustles in last year's leaves, then the clock on the belfry strikes the quarter. One might sit without moving, listen and think, and think. An old woman passed by with a wallet on her back. The princess thought that it would be nice to stop the old woman and to say something friendly and cordial to her, to help her, but the old woman turned the corner without once looking round. Not long afterwards, a tall man with a grey beard and a straw hat came along the walk. When he came up to the princess, he took off his hat and bowed. From the bald patch on his head and his sharp, hooked nose, the princess recognised him as the doctor, Mikhail Ivanovich, who had been in her service at Dubovki. She remembered that someone had told her that his wife had died the year before, and she wanted to sympathise with him, to console him. "Doctor, I expect you don't recognise me," she said with an affable smile. "Yes, Princess, I recognised you," said the doctor, taking off his hat again. "Oh, thank you. I was afraid that you too had forgotten your princess. People only remember their enemies, but they forget their friends. Have you too come to pray?" "I'm the doctor here, and I have to spend the night at the monastery every Saturday." "Well, how are you?" said the princess, sighing. "I hear that you've lost your wife. What a calamity." "Yes, Princess. For me it is a great calamity." "There's nothing for it. We must bear our troubles with resignation. Not one hair of a man's head is lost without the divine will." "Yes, Princess." To the princess's friendly, gentle smile and her sighs, the doctor responded coldly and dryly, "Yes, Princess," and the expression of his face was cold and dry. "What else can I say to him?" she wondered. "How long it is since we met," she said. 5 years. How much water has flowed under the bridge? How many changes in that time? It quite frightens one to think of it. You know, I'm married. I'm not a countess now, but a princess, and by now I'm separated from my husband too." "Yes, I heard so. God has sent me many trials. No doubt you've heard too that I'm almost ruined. My Dubovki, Sofyino and Kiriakovo have all been sold for my unhappy husband's debts, and I have only Baronovo and Mihailtsevo left. It's terrible to look back. How many changes and misfortunes of all kinds. How many mistakes." "Yes, Princess, many mistakes." The princess was a little disconcerted. She knew her mistakes. They were all of such a private character that no one but she could think or speak of them. She could not resist asking, "What mistakes are you thinking about?" "You referred to them, so you know them," answered the doctor, and he smiled. "Why talk about them?" "No, tell me, doctor. I shall be very grateful to you, and please don't stand on ceremony with me. I love to hear the truth." "I'm not your judge, Princess." "Not my judge? What a tone you take. You must know something about me. Tell me." "If you really wish it, very well. Only I regret to say that I'm not clever at talking, and people can't always understand me." The doctor thought for a moment, and began. "A lot of mistakes, but the most important of them, in my opinion, was the general spirit that prevailed on all your estates. You see, I don't know how to express myself. I mean chiefly the lack of love, the aversion for people that was felt in absolutely everything. Your whole system as life was built upon that aversion. Aversion for the human voice, for faces, for heads, steps, in fact for everything that makes up a human being. At all the doors and on the stairs there stand sleek, rude and lazy grooms in livery to prevent badly dressed persons from entering the house. In the hall there are chairs with high backs, so that the footmen waiting there during balls and receptions may not soil the walls with their heads. In every room there are thick carpets, that no human step may be heard. Everyone who comes in is infallibly warned to speak as softly and as little as possible, and to say nothing that might have a disagreeable effect on the nerves or the imagination. And in your room you don't shake hands with anyone or ask him to sit down, just as you didn't shake hands with me or ask me to sit down." "By all means, if you like," said the princess, smiling and holding out her hand. "Really, to be cross about such trifles." "But I am not cross," laughed the doctor, but at once he flushed, took off his hat, and waving it about began hotly, "To be candid, I've long wanted an opportunity to tell you all I think. That is, I want to tell you that you look upon the mass of mankind from the Napoleonic standpoint, as food for the cannon. But Napoleon had at least some idea. You have nothing except aversion." "I have an aversion for people," smiled the princess, shrugging her shoulders in astonishment. "I have." "Yes, you want facts? By all means. In Mihaltsevo 3 former cooks of yours who have gone blind in your kitchen from the heat of the stove are living upon charity. All the health and strength and good looks that is found on your hundreds of thousands of acres is taken by you and your parasites for your grooms, your footmen and your coachmen. All these 2-legged cattle are trained to be flunkies, overeat themselves, grow coarse, lose the image and likeness, in fact. Young doctors, agricultural experts, teachers, intellectual workers generally, think of it, are torn away from their honest work and forced, for a crust of bread, to take part in all sorts of mummeries which make every decent man feel ashamed. Some young men cannot be in your service for 3 years without becoming hypocrites, toadies, sneaks. Is that a good thing? Your Polish superintendents, those abject spies, all those Kazimers and Kajetans, go hunting about on your hundreds of thousands of acres from morning to night, and to please you try to get 3 skins off 1 ox. Excuse me, I speak disconnectedly, but that doesn't matter. You don't look upon the simple people as human beings, and even the princes, counts and bishops who used to come and see you looked upon simply as decorative figures, not as living beings. But the worst of all, the thing that most revolts me, is having a fortune of over 1 million and doing nothing for other people. Nothing." The princess sat amazed, aghast, offended, not knowing what to say or how to behave. She had never before been spoken to in such a tone. The doctor's unpleasant, angry voice and his clumsy, faltering phrases made a harsh clattering noise in her ears and her head. Then she began to feel as though the gesticulating doctor was hitting her on the head with his hat. "It's not true," she articulated softly in an imploring voice. "I've done a great deal of good for other people. You know it yourself." "Nonsense," cried the doctor. "Can you possibly go on thinking of your philanthropic work as something genuine and useful, and not a mere mummery? It was a farce from beginning to end. It was playing at loving your neighbour, the most open farce which even children and stupid peasant women saw through. Take, for instance, your, what was it called, House for Homeless Old Women Without Relations, of which you made me something like head doctor, and of which you were the patroness. Mercy on us, what a charming institution it was! A house was built with parquet floors and a weathercock on the roof. 12 old women were collected from the villages and made to sleep under blankets and sheets of Dutch linen, and given toffee to eat." The doctor gave a malignant chuckle into his hat and went on speaking rapidly and stammering. "It was a farce. The attendants kept the sheets and blankets under lock and key, for fear the old women should soil them. 'Let the old devil's pepper pot sleep on the floor.' The old women did not dare to sit down on the beds, to put on their jackets, to walk over the polished floors. Everything was kept for show and hidden away from the old women as though they were thieves, and the old women were clothed and fed on the sly by other people's charity, and prayed to God night and day to be released from their prison and from the canting exhortations of the sleek rascals to whose care you committed them. And what did the managers do? It was simply charming. About twice a week there would be 35,000 messages to say that the princess, that is you, were coming to the home the next day. That meant that next day I had to abandon my patients, dress up and be on parade. Very good, I arrive. The old women, in everything clean and new, are already drawn up in a row waiting. Near them struts the old garrison rat, the superintendent with his mawkish, sneaking smile. The old women yawn and exchange glances, but are afraid to complain. We wait. The junior steward gallops up. Half an hour later the senior steward, then the superintendent of the accounts office, then another and then another of them. They keep arriving endlessly. They all have mysterious, solemn faces. We wait and wait, shift from one leg to another, look at the clock, all this in monumental silence because we all hate each other like poison. 1 hour passes, then a second, and then at last the carriage is seen in the distance, and the doctor went off into a shrill laugh and brought out in a shrill voice, You get out of the carriage, and the old hags, at the word of command from the old garrison rat, begin chanting, "The glory of our Lord in Zion, the tongue of man cannot express." A pretty scene, wasn't it? The doctor went off into a bass chuckle and waved his hand as though to signify that he could not utter another word for laughing. He laughed heavily, harshly, with clenched teeth, as ill-natured people laugh, and from his voice, from his face, from his glittering, rather insolent eyes, it could be seen that he had a profound contempt for the princess, for the home, and for the old women. There was nothing amusing or laughable in all that he described so clumsily and coarsely, but he laughed with satisfaction, even with delight. "And the school," he went on, panting from laughter. "Do you remember how you wanted to teach peasant children yourself? You must have taught them very well, for very soon the children all ran away, so that they had to be thrashed and bribed to come and be taught. And do you remember how you wanted to feed with your own hands the infants whose mothers were working in the fields? You went about the village crying because the infants were not at your disposal, as the mothers would take them to the fields with them. Then the village foreman ordered the mothers by turns to leave their infants behind for your entertainment. A strange thing, they all ran away from your benevolence like mice from a cat. And why was it? It's very simple. Not because our people are ignorant and ungrateful, as you always explained it to yourself, but because in all your fads, if you'll excuse the word, there wasn't a ha'porth of love and kindness. There was nothing but the desire to amuse yourself with living puppets, nothing else. A person who does not feel the difference between a human being and a lapdog ought not to go in for philanthropy. I assure you, there's a great difference between human beings and lapdogs." The princess's heart was beating dreadfully. There was a thudding in her ears, and she still felt as though the doctor were beating her on the head with his hat. The doctor talked quickly, excitedly and uncouthly, stammering and gesticulating unnecessarily. All she grasped was that she was being spoken to by a coarse, ill-bred, spiteful and ungrateful man. But what he wanted of her and what he was talking about she could not understand. "Go away," she said in a tearful voice, putting up her hands to protect her head from the doctor's hat. "Go away." "And how you treat your servants," the doctor went on indignantly. "You treat them as the lowest scoundrels, and you don't look upon them as human beings. For example, allow me to ask you, why did you dismiss me? For 10 years I worked for your father and afterwards for you, honestly, without vacations or holidays. I gained the love of all for more than 70 miles round, and suddenly one fine day I'm informed that I'm no longer wanted. What for? I've no idea to this day. I, a doctor of medicine, a gentleman by birth, a student of the Moscow University, father of a family, am such a petty, insignificant insect that you can kick me out without explaining the reason? Why stand on ceremony with me? I heard afterwards that my wife went without my knowledge 3 times to intercede with you for me. You wouldn't receive her. I'm told she cried in your hall, and I shall never forgive her for it, never." The doctor paused and clenched his teeth, making an intense effort to think of something more to say, very unpleasant and vindictive. He thought of something, and his cold, frowning face suddenly brightened. "Take your attitude to this monastery," he said with avidity. "You've never spared anyone, and the holier the place, the more chance of its suffering from your loving kindness and angelic sweetness. Why do you come here? What do you want with the monks here? Allow me to ask you. What is Hecuba to you, or you to Hecuba? It's another farce, another amusement for you, another sacrilege against human dignity and nothing more. Why, you don't believe in the monk's God. You've a God of your own in your heart whom you've evolved for yourself at spiritualist seances. You look with condescension upon the ritual of the church. You don't go to mass or vespers. You sleep till midday. Why do you come here? You come with a God of your own into a monastery you have nothing to do with, and you imagine that the monks look upon it as a very great honour. To be sure they do. You'd better ask, by the way, what your visits cost the monastery. You were graciously pleased to arrive here this evening, and a messenger from your estate arrived on horseback the day before yesterday to warn them of your coming. They were the whole day yesterday getting the rooms ready and expecting you. This morning your advance guard arrived, an insolent maid who keeps running across the courtyard, rustling her skirts, pestering them with questions, giving orders. I can't endure it. The monks have been on the lookout all day, for if you were not met with due ceremony there would be trouble. You'd complain to the bishop, "The monks don't like me, your holiness. I don't know what I've done to displease them. It's true I'm a great sinner, but I'm so unhappy." Already one monastery has been in hot water over you. The Father Superior is a busy, learned man. He hasn't a free moment, and you keep sending for him to come to your rooms. Not a trace of respect for age or for rank. If at least you were a bountiful giver to the monastery, one wouldn't resent it so much. But all this time the monks have not received 100 roubles from you." Whenever people worried the princess, misunderstood her, or mortified her, and when she did not know what to say or do, she usually began to cry. And on this occasion too she ended by hiding her face in her hands and crying aloud in a thin treble like a child. The doctor suddenly stopped and looked at her. His face darkened and grew stern. "Forgive me, princess," he said in a hollow voice. "I've given way to a malicious feeling and forgotten myself. It was not right." And, coughing in an embarrassed way, he walked away quickly, without remembering to put his hat on. Stars were already twinkling in the sky. The moon must have been rising on the further side of the monastery, for the sky was clear, soft, and transparent. Bats were flitting noiselessly along the white monastery wall. The clock slowly struck 3/4, probably 8:45. The princess got up and walked slowly to the gate. She felt wounded and was crying, and she felt that the trees and the stars and even the bats were pitying her, and that the clock struck musically only to express its sympathy with her. She cried and thought how nice it would be to go into a monastery for the rest of her life. On still summer evenings she would walk alone through the avenues, insulted, injured, misunderstood by people, and only God and the starry heavens would see the martyr's tears. The evening service was still going on in the church. The princess stopped and listened to the singing. How beautiful the singing sounded in the still darkness. How sweet to weep and suffer to the sound of that singing. Going into her rooms, she looked at her tear-stained face in the glass and powdered it. Then she sat down to supper. The monks knew that she liked pickled sturgeon, little mushrooms, malaga, and plain honey cakes that left a taste of cypress in the mouth, and every time she came they gave her all these dishes. As she ate the mushrooms and drank the malaga, the princess dreamed of how she would be finally ruined and deserted, how all her stewards, bailiffs, clerks, and maidservants for whom she had done so much would be false to her and begin to say rude things, how people all the world over would set upon her, speak ill of her, jeer at her. She would renounce her title, would renounce society and luxury, and would go into a convent without one word of reproach to anyone. She would pray for her enemies, and then they would all understand her and come to beg her forgiveness, but by that time it would be too late. After supper she knelt down in the corner before the icon and read 2 chapters of the Gospel. Then her maid made her bed and she got into it. Stretching herself under the white quilt, she heaved a sweet, deep sigh, as one sighs after crying, closed her eyes, and began to fall asleep. In the morning she waked up and glanced at her watch. It was 9:30. On the carpet near the bed was a bright, narrow streak of sunlight from a ray that came in at the window and dimly lighted up the room. Flies were buzzing behind the black curtain at the window. "It's early," thought the princess, and she closed her eyes. Stretching and lying snug in her bed, she recalled her meeting yesterday with the doctor and all the thoughts with which she had gone to sleep the night before. She remembered she was unhappy. Then she thought of her husband living in Petersburg, her stewards, doctors, neighbours, the officials of her acquaintance. A long procession of familiar masculine faces passed before her imagination. She smiled and thought, if only these people could see into her heart and understand her, then they would all be at her feet. At 11:15 she called her maid. "Help me to dress, Dasha," she said languidly, "but go first and tell them to get out the horses. I must set off for Klavdia Nikolaevna's." Going out to get into the carriage, she blinked at the glaring daylight and laughed with pleasure. It was a wonderfully fine day. As she scanned from her half-closed eyes the monks who had gathered round the steps to see her off, she nodded graciously and said, "Goodbye, my friends, till the day after tomorrow." It was an agreeable surprise to her that the doctor was with the monks by the steps. His face was pale and severe. "Princess," he said with a guilty smile, taking off his hat, "I've been waiting here a long time to see you. Forgive me for God's sake. I was carried away yesterday by an evil, vindictive feeling, and I talked nonsense. In short, I beg your pardon." The princess smiled graciously and held out her hand for him to kiss. He kissed it, turning red. Trying to look like a bird, the princess fluttered into the carriage and nodded in all directions. There was a gay, warm, serene feeling in her heart, and she felt herself that her smile was particularly soft and friendly. As the carriage rolled towards the gates, and afterwards along the dusty road past huts and gardens, past long trains of wagons and strings of pilgrims on their way to the monastery, she still screwed up her eyes and smiled softly. She was thinking there was no higher bliss than to bring warmth, light, and joy wherever one went, to forgive injuries, to smile graciously on one's enemies. The peasants she passed bowed to her. The carriage rustled softly. Clouds of dust rose from under the wheels and floated over the golden rye, and it seemed to the princess that her body was swaying not on carriage cushions but on clouds, and that she herself was like a light, transparent little cloud. "How happy I am," she murmured, shutting her eyes. "How happy I am."